no one expected anything unusual that week. 3I/Atlas was supposed to be just another visitor, another frozen traveler drifting through the dark. Another name added to the long list of objects that pass by our sun and disappear forever. But sometimes, the things we ignore are the things that change everything. For months, astronomers around the world watched it move toward perihelion, the point where it would get closest to the sun. They tracked it like they track everything else, with quiet patience, long nights, and the soft hum of machines that never sleep. To them, 3I/Atlas was routine, predictable, a cold piece of rock from a place we may never see. But then, something shifted. It happened on a calm Tuesday morning, a moment that should have been ordinary, a moment that should have passed without a single ripple. Instead, it became the beginning of a question we still don't know how to answer. Because when the first readings came in, the screens inside those observatories didn't show silence. They didn't show darkness. They didn't show the quiet behavior of a distant comet. They showed light, a soft glow, faint at first, but growing. A glow that shouldn't exist. One scientist later said it felt like watching a candle flicker in a sealed jar, a flame with no oxygen, no reason, yet somehow still alive. And that glow was coming from 3I/Atlas, not from sunlight, not from heat, not from anything we understand. It was glowing before it even touched direct sunlight. For a moment, the room went silent. The kind of silence where you can feel everyone breathing, but no one speaking. The kind of silence that happens when the world shifts by 1 degree, and no one knows it yet. Astronomers ran the numbers again and again and again. They checked the instruments. They reset them. They compared notes with teams on the other side of the world. Every result came back the same. 3I/Atlas wasn't reflecting light. It was making it, like a lantern drifting through deep space, turning on long before dawn. And that's when the unease began. Because comets don't glow on their own. They don't light up in cold space. They don't behave like this. There was no model, no theory, no textbook explanation that made sense of what they were seeing. Something was wrong. But no one said that out loud, not yet. Instead, they did what scientists always do. They searched for the mistake. Maybe a sensor malfunctioned. Maybe the angle was wrong. Maybe the data was corrupted by cosmic rays or background noise. But every test returned the same answer. The glow was real, and it was getting brighter. By the next day, observatories in Chile, Hawaii, and Australia all confirmed it. Separate telescopes, separate instruments, separate teams, yet all of them saw the same impossible thing. A cold object drifting through the void, turning into a beacon. One researcher described it as a halo. Another said it looked like a heat shimmer without heat. A third refused to describe it at all. He just stared at the screen, shaking his head, whispering, "This doesn't happen. This doesn't happen." Still, this wasn't fear. Not yet. It was confusion. A slow, growing unease, like hearing footsteps in an empty hallway and not knowing if they're coming closer. The deeper they looked, the stranger it became. The glow wasn't random. It wasn't flickering the way gases usually do. It didn't behave like dust scattering sunlight. It pulsed. Not fast, not loud, just a gentle, steady rise and fall, as if something inside the object was breathing. It brightened, then dimmed, then brightened again. The rhythm wasn't perfect, but it was close, too close to ignore. And that's when the first whispers started. Quiet conversations in hallways. Late-night emails. Questions that sounded like jokes, but weren't. What if it's not natural? What if it's reacting to something? What if this is the first sign of... No one ever finished that sentence. Not yet, because the truth was too heavy to speak. For now, all they could do was watch. Watch as the glow grew stronger. Watch as the rhythm became clearer. Watch as 3I/Atlas approached the sun, not like a comet, but like something awake. Some scientists tried to stay calm. They reminded everyone that nature is full of surprises, that there are still things we don't understand, that this could be some unknown chemical reaction or a rare dust behavior. But deep down, everyone felt the same thing. This wasn't just unusual. It was intentional. Something about the timing, the shape of the glow, the steady pulse felt too precise, too deliberate. And that feeling spread through the astronomy community like a quiet storm. A slow realization that something was coming toward us, something we hadn't seen before. For the first time, the world wasn't looking at a comet. It was looking at a question drifting through the dark, a question lighting itself without the sun, a question no one knew how to answer. And as 3I/Atlas moved closer to perihelion, one last detail made the situation even stranger. The glow was growing faster, almost like the object knew it was being watched, almost like it was responding, almost like it was waking up. That's when scientists finally stopped asking how and started asking the question that kept them up all night. Why is this object lighting up before even touching sunlight? And more importantly, what happens when it does? Because the glow wasn't just a warning sign. It wasn't just a mystery. It wasn't just an anomaly that could be explained away. It was the beginning, the first breath, the first heartbeat, the first quiet signal that something strange was entering our world. Something old, something unknown, something alive, or something built. And as 3I/Atlas drifted silently toward the sun, one truth became impossible to ignore. Whatever this object was, it wasn't here by accident. And its arrival was just the start. Sometimes the universe speaks in patterns, soft, subtle, easy to miss. But once you see them, you can't unsee them. And for the scientists watching 3I/Atlas, that moment came with a single graph, a single curve, a single line on a screen that was supposed to be boring. But it wasn't. Not this time. It began the way most discoveries begin, with someone doing something routine. Plotting the incoming light curve data, line by line, point by point. Nothing special, nothing dramatic, just math. But somewhere in the middle of that graph, something bent, something shifted, something broke the rules. The curve didn't rise smoothly, the way a comet's brightness usually does. It didn't fade slowly, the way frozen dust scatters sunlight. It dipped, then climbed, then dipped again. Not like noise, not like randomness, not like nature. It repeated, almost perfectly. The first scientist who saw it leaned closer to the screen, almost touching the glass. At first, they thought it was a glitch, a missing data point, maybe interference, maybe the instrument sneezed. So they zoomed in, and then the room got very, very quiet, because the shape looked familiar. Not scientifically familiar, but human familiar. It looked like a heartbeat, not sharp like a spike, but soft, steady, alive, a slow rise, a gentle fall. A rise again, a pulse, and once you saw the rhythm, it became impossible to ignore. They checked the timing. 38 minutes between each peak. 38 minutes between each dip. 38 minutes. Again and again and again. No comet in recorded history has ever pulsed like that. Not one. And that was the moment the scientists realized they weren't looking at a mistake. They were looking at something that seemed intentional. In the next hour, phones buzzed. Emails flew across continents. Screenshots traveled faster than the object itself. Observatories in Hawaii, Spain, India, South Africa, all of them plotted their own curves. And every graph told the same quiet, impossible story. 3I/Atlas was pulsing, with perfect timing. The kind of timing nature doesn't create. The kind of timing you find in machines, not comets. Still, no one wanted to jump to conclusions. No one wanted to be the first person in history to say something reckless. So they tested everything. They checked the calibration. They checked the background. They checked the angles, the filters, the sensors, the software, even the electricity running through the walls. Everything was clean. Everything was perfect. Nothing explained the pulse, and every time they refreshed the data, the heartbeat returned. Soft, steady, patient. 38 minutes. Every time. One scientist later said that watching it felt like standing in a dark room, hearing footsteps somewhere behind you. Slow, distant, but too regular to be an accident. Another said it felt like the object was breathing in the dark. But no matter how people described it, the truth was the same. The curve refused to behave. It refused to fade. It refused to disappear. If anything, it grew sharper. By the end of the first day, the pulse was clearer than ever, strong, stable, almost confident. And that rhythm did something dangerous. It planted a thought in people's minds, a thought no one wanted to admit. Because a pulse means pattern. Pattern means control. Control means intention. And intention means something is acting on its own. That idea spread quietly. No one said it out loud yet. Not in official reports, not in meetings, not in the emails that could be archived and quoted decades later. But late at night, when the labs were dark, when the glow of the screen was the only light in the room, people whispered. What natural object pulses like this? What if it's not reacting to sunlight at all? What if something inside it is causing this? And the most frightening question of all, what if this is not a comet? Because comets don't keep time. Comets don't hold rhythm. Comets don't follow a schedule like a clock. Something else does. But even that wasn't the strangest part. The real shock came on the second night. A junior researcher was looking at the curve, half asleep, sipping cold coffee. He nudged the scale on the graph just to see it stretched out. And the moment he did that, the room went still. Because something hiding inside the curve suddenly appeared. A second rhythm, fainter, smaller, almost invisible. A tiny pulse inside the bigger pulse, like a whisper hiding inside a heartbeat. And that's when the questions changed. That's when the tone shifted from curiosity to dread. Because this wasn't just a repeating pattern, it was a structure, a layered pattern. A pattern inside another pattern. Nature doesn't do that by accident. Not with this level of precision. And suddenly, the scientists realized something chilling. The deeper they looked into the curve, the more it looked like something designed, something built, something organized. The anomaly wasn't just refusing to fade. It was growing sharper the closer they studied it, like it wanted to be found, like it wanted to be understood, like it was trying to speak. One researcher described the moment best. He said, "It felt like the universe had tapped us on the shoulder. And for the first time, we turned around." But they couldn't answer the most important question, the question hanging heavy in every lab that night. What natural object pulses with perfect timing? The honest answer, the one everyone was afraid to say, was simple. None. Nothing in nature behaves like this. Nothing in the known universe shows this level of coordination. So if it's not a natural object, then what is it? A machine? A signal? A leftover fragment of something ancient? Or something visiting us? Something we don't have a name for yet? No one knew. All they knew was this: the curve had broken the rules. And the rules weren't bending back. The pulse continued. Silent, steady, perfect, as 3I/Atlas drifted closer to the sun. And for the first time, humanity felt the faint, uneasy sense that something was watching us back. Something patient, something old, something waking up. And the heartbeat was only the beginning. Sometimes the strangest discoveries don't come from what we see, but from what we feel. And for the scientists tracking 3I/Atlas, that feeling came in the form of heat. Heat where no heat should exist. It started late one night when the world was quiet. Most people were asleep. But in one small control room, lit by glowing screens and empty coffee cups, an engineer stared at a set of numbers that made no sense. Infrared sensors had begun picking up something unexpected, a soft rise in temperature, then a fall, then another rise, slow, calm, rhythmic, almost alive. At first, he blinked it away. Tired eyes, long shifts, probably just noise. But when he zoomed in, the pattern sharpened. It wasn't random. It wasn't chaotic. It was steady. A warm wave, then a cool wave, like an inhale and an exhale. As if 3I/Atlas was breathing. The engineer felt a chill crawl up his back. Space is cold, colder than anything we can imagine. Objects drifting through deep space don't warm and cool themselves like this. But this one did. Over and over, again and again, with the patience of something ancient. He called in another researcher. Then another. Soon, 5 people were crowded around a single screen, whispering into the quiet room. They checked the equipment. They checked the timing. They checked everything that could be checked. And still, the pattern continued. A slow rise, a slow fall, perfectly smooth. But even then, even in that moment, some scientists didn't want to believe it. "It's noise," one of them said. "Cosmic radiation. Background interference." He wanted it to be normal. He wanted it to be safe. Because if it wasn't noise, then it meant something far more troubling. So they ran the data through filters. They compared readings from different telescopes. They checked how the signal changed as the object moved. And with every test, the same truth came back. The thermal waves were real. They weren't spikes. They weren't errors. They weren't artifacts. They were cycles, intentional cycles. Still, the team stayed cautious. Scientists don't jump to wild ideas, not without proof. But the universe has a way of removing doubt at the exact moment you feel safe. And the moment came with a single line of code. A young intern, barely out of college, had the idea. He wondered if the thermal oscillations matched the strange light pulses discovered earlier. No one expected a connection. Most assumed he was just eager to impress, but he pressed the keys anyway. He fed the thermal data into the same timeline as the brightness pulses, and the room went silent. Every thermal rise, every thermal fall aligned perfectly with the light pulses. Not close, not almost. Perfect, like a heartbeat, matching a breath. Two signals working together. And in that moment, the idea nobody wanted to consider became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a natural object reacting to sunlight. This wasn't a comet shedding ice in random bursts. This wasn't the quiet chaos of space. This was coordination. Something was controlling its own temperature. Something was regulating its own energy. Something was deciding how warm it should be and when. One scientist stepped back from the screen, shaking her head. "No object in the universe does this," she whispered. "Nothing without guidance." But the scariest part wasn't the heat cycles themselves. It was the purpose behind them. Because when they studied the pattern closer, they found a detail that made their stomachs drop. The heating phase always happened slightly before each pulse of light, like the object was charging itself, storing energy, then releasing it. Not randomly, not instinctively, deliberately. It was the kind of thermal behavior you'd expect from a machine storing power, not a comet drifting through empty space. And once that thought entered the room, no one could push it away. Still, they tried. They threw every possible natural explanation at the data. Maybe there were hidden pockets of gas, releasing in cycles. Maybe sunlight was bouncing off fragments they couldn't see. Maybe cold space dust was creating strange shadows. But every idea collapsed under its own weight. The thermal pattern was too smooth, too regular, too alive. And, most troubling of all, it was speeding up. Not by much, just a fraction of a degree, a fraction of a minute. But it was real. The heating and cooling waves were happening faster, as if 3I/Atlas was preparing for something. One researcher compared it to an animal waking from hibernation. Another said it reminded him of an engine warming up. But everyone agreed on one thing. This wasn't a dead rock anymore. Something inside it was changing. Something was shifting. Something was coming online. And as the thermal rhythm aligned more and more with the light pulses, a deeper fear settled in. Because patterns like this don't appear by accident. They don't emerge from ice and dust. They don't come from chaos. Patterns like this are chosen. They are built. They are designed. And yet, no one could say by whom, or why, or how long it had been like this. A silence spread through the room, the kind of silence that presses down on the chest, the kind that feels like holding your breath without meaning to. One scientist finally said the words everyone else was avoiding. "This isn't thermal behavior. This is control." Control. A simple word, but a terrifying one. Because if something was controlling its temperature, what else could it control? Its rotation, its path, its pulse? Was it sending a signal? Was it waking up? Or was it waiting? No one had answers, only questions. And at the center of all of them was a single impossible truth. The thermal pattern didn't just act alive, it acted aware. As if the object wasn't drifting through space. As if it was watching, thinking, choosing. And as 3I/Atlas continued its silent journey toward the sun, the scientists knew one thing for certain. The temperature shifts were not an accident, not a glitch, not noise. Something was guiding them, something with purpose and patience, something that had just begun to reveal itself. And whatever it was no longer hiding. The question now wasn't just, is something controlling its thermal shift? It was something far more unsettling. If something is controlling it, what happens when it finally takes full control? There are moments in science when the universe feels like it's whispering to us. Softly, carefully, like it wants to be heard, but only by those who are truly paying attention. And for the teams tracking 3I/Atlas, that whisper arrived as light. Not heat, not sound, not radiation, but light that behaved in a way no natural object ever has. It began during a routine observation, the kind of check-in scientists do 100 times a day, half out of habit, half out of hope. The object was rotating, slow and steady, drifting through the dark like a lonely traveler. Everything about it seemed normal, until the brightness spiked. A sharp flash, clean and sudden, cut across the graph. Not random, not chaotic, but crisp, like the edge of something smooth, catching the sun for just a moment. One scientist froze. He waited for it to fade. He waited for the numbers to settle back into familiar shapes. They didn't. Minutes later, the flash returned. Same strength, same duration, same angle, a perfect repeat. He rewound the feed. He played it again and again. The object was rotating, yes, but the flashes were hitting at exact intervals, as if something flat, something reflective, was turning in and out of view. This wasn't what comets do. Natural rocks scatter light. They shimmer, they flicker, they fade. Their surfaces are rough, broken, chaotic. But this was precise. This was clean. This was geometric. More scientists arrived in the room. They stared at the monitor, each flash catching their attention like a tiny shout from across the void. Reflectivity spikes, spaced perfectly apart. At first, they thought it might be ice sheets, large crystals, smooth patches of frozen material. But when they calculated the angle, the sharp angle of those reflections, the room shifted. Because ice doesn't create edges that precise. Dust doesn't shine in straight lines, and no natural formation spins with the timing of a machine. Something was off. Something felt engineered. They ran the numbers again and again. Each time, the same haunting truth emerged. The reflective spots weren't random patches. They were arranged. Every spike lined up like the markers on a clock, equally spaced, perfectly timed. A pattern too deliberate to ignore. It was as if the object was covered in panels, plates, sections of something smooth and angled. One researcher quietly whispered the word no one wanted to hear. Surfaces. Another added, flat surfaces. A third took a breath and said, the part everyone was thinking. No natural rock shines like that. Still, they looked for natural explanations. They tried. They checked for crystal formations, for reflective minerals, for sheets of frozen gas, for anything that could create a sharp, predictable beam. Nothing fit, because nature doesn't build straight lines in deep space. It doesn't decide where to place flat surfaces. It doesn't schedule reflections like a ticking clock. But the data did. The spikes repeated, like they were following instructions, and that's when the unease in the room deepened into something heavier. Because if the surfaces weren't natural, then they were not formed by the universe. They were formed by something inside the object, or someone who shaped it, long before it ever drifted toward us. The scientists zoomed in on the raw data, pixel by pixel, frame by frame. The reflective areas weren't random blobs. They had edges, boundaries, angles so clean they could have been drawn with a ruler. One angle stood out, an exact 90 degrees. A right angle, the kind that appears in buildings, in machines, in human tools, but not in drifting cosmic debris. A right angle in space is like finding a footprint on an empty beach. It doesn't just happen. And suddenly, 3I/Atlas didn't feel like a comet anymore. It felt like a structure. They compared the reflectivity against known materials: steel, titanium, silicates, even experimental alloys used in satellites. Nothing matched perfectly, but some readings came frighteningly close. The spikes had the sharp signature of polished metal. Not exactly like ours, but close enough to trigger a question no one dared voice. Are we looking at a machine? The room went quiet. Not the kind of quiet that follows a joke, the kind that follows a realization, a heavy quiet. A quiet that feels like standing at the edge of something enormous. Because if the object had panels, if it had plates, if it had smooth, geometric surfaces, then 3I/Atlas wasn't just moving through space. It was designed to. It wasn't drifting, it was traveling. Yet even with all the evidence stacked in front of them, some scientists clung to disbelief. It could still be natural, someone said. A fluke, a rare formation. But inside, even they knew the truth. Nature creates beauty. Nature creates chaos. Nature creates mystery. But nature does not create symmetry like this. It does not place reflective surfaces evenly around a spinning object. It does not shine in perfect intervals. Only intention does that. Only purpose. Only design. And as the data continued to pour in, another detail made the situation even more unsettling. The reflections were getting brighter. Not randomly, but steadily, predictably. Almost like the object wanted to be seen. Like it was turning its surfaces towards us. On purpose. As if it was signaling. As if it was waking up. As if it knew it had reached the point in its journey where hiding no longer mattered. And the deeper the scientists looked, the more a single truth pressed itself into their minds. This was not a natural rock. This was not a frozen traveler. This was something built, something engineered, something that gleamed with intention in the light of our sun. The question now wasn't just, how can a natural object shine like a machine? The real question was, what kind of machine survives long enough to arrive from another star? Because if those surfaces were truly panels, if those reflections were truly controlled, then 3I/Atlas wasn't just visiting our solar system. It was returning. And whatever those surfaces were meant for, they were only just beginning to reveal themselves. There are two things the universe is never short of: darkness and noise. Even in the deepest, coldest corners of space, there's always a faint hiss, the leftover hum of creation, the quiet static of stars burning billions of miles away. Space is never truly silent, until the day 3I/Atlas crossed the ecliptic. It started with a single antenna in New Mexico, a massive metal dish pointing into the void, listening like it always did. gathering whispers from distant galaxies, tracking cosmic rays, mapping cold signals from objects no one will ever see. But on that afternoon, something changed. The background hiss, that soft cosmic static that's always there, suddenly dropped. Not slowly, not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had turned the universe off with a switch. At first, the operator thought the system crashed. Machines fail, cables come loose, computers freeze. He tapped the monitor, checked the cables, ran a quick diagnostic. Everything was fine. Everything worked. But the universe was quiet. Too quiet. He called his supervisor. Then, another technician. They replayed the data feeds, hoping it was a glitch. It wasn't. The silence was real. And the silence was moving. Because when they mapped the coordinates of the dead zone, a shape began to appear. A shape centered around a single object drifting across the ecliptic plane. 3I/Atlas. Like a bubble of quiet surrounding it, swallowing every signal, every whisper, every piece of cosmic noise. This shouldn't happen. Not in physics. Not in astronomy. Not in the universe as we know it. Space doesn't mute itself. But this object did. The news spread fast. Within an hour, antennas in South Africa, Spain, Japan, and Australia all confirmed the same impossibility. Whenever 3I/Atlas passed overhead, the noise stopped. Not reduced, not distorted, stopped. A perfect circle of silence that followed the object like a shadow. Scientists kept checking their equipment, terrified that something was broken, terrified that something wasn't. But every test came back clean. It wasn't the machines, it wasn't the atmosphere, it wasn't solar wind. The silence was physical. It had boundaries, edges, a measurable radius, like a shield. One radio astronomer described it best. It felt like the universe was holding its breath. They plotted the silence bubble on a 3D model. It wasn't ragged or messy. It was smooth, even, symmetrical, a perfect sphere of muted space surrounding 3I/Atlas as it drifted across the ecliptic, the invisible highway where most planets orbit. The implications were terrifying, because silence like this doesn't happen in nature. Not this clean. Not this perfect. Cosmic radiation always bleeds through. Background noise always finds a way. Starlight echoes everywhere. But here, the silence was absolute. Like a void inside the void. Something was blocking noise. Something was absorbing it. Or bending it. Or shutting it out completely. One scientist suggested it could be an unknown plasma field. Another thought it might be a strange electromagnetic effect. But none of their theories explained the clean edges, the perfect shape, the way the silence followed the object like a living thing. And then came the moment that turned curiosity into fear. A team in Australia detected a faint radio signal from a distant pulsar, a star that normally beats in a steady rhythm. But as 3I/Atlas moved into alignment with it, the pulsar's rhythm vanished, as if someone placed a hand over a speaker. When the object drifted past, the rhythm returned, perfectly, not delayed, not weakened, just gone, then back, like flipping a switch. This wasn't a natural effect. This was control. Something around 3I/Atlas was strong enough to mute not only local cosmic noise, but distant starlight. Which meant one thing: the silence wasn't a side effect. It was intentional. But intentional for what? To hide itself? To protect something? To mask communication? No one knew. Not yet. The questions grew darker. If something can silence the universe around it, could it silence our signals too? Could it block spacecraft, satellites, Earth itself? And if the silence is a shield, what is it protecting? The teams studying the object tried to remain calm. They repeated the data checks. They analyzed the shape of the silence bubble. They studied how it shifted, how it grew, how it pulsed around the object. But the more they watched, the clearer it became. The silence wasn't random. It changed depending on 3I/Atlas's rotation. It stretched at certain angles. It tightened at others, almost like the object was directing it, steering it, controlling the bubble around itself. A scientist from Tokyo murmured something that sent chills across the room. It feels like it's listening and doesn't want anything listening to it. Because that's what silence is, after all. A way to hide, a way to protect, a way to stay unseen or unheard. The deeper they studied, the more the silence felt less like an absence and more like a presence. Something was happening around 3I/Atlas, something the universe wasn't allowed to hear. And as the object drifted away from the ecliptic, the background noise slowly returned. A soft hiss, a gentle static, the familiar hum of space breathing again. But something had changed, because now every telescope, every dish, every scientist was waiting. Waiting to see if the silence would return. Waiting to see if the object was hiding something larger. Waiting to see if the quiet was a warning. One researcher summed up the fear no one wanted to admit. When something makes the universe go quiet, it's not the universe I'm afraid of. Because silence is not empty. Silence is intentional. Silence is a choice. And whatever was inside that bubble, whatever was drifting through the dark with a shield of quiet wrapped around its skin, was not a comet. It was something that knew how to hide, something that didn't want to be heard. And as 3I/Atlas crossed into deeper space, leaving that strange silence behind, one question lingered in every mind. If it can silence the cosmos around it, what will it do when it decides to speak? Sometimes the universe gives us warnings long before it gives us answers. And sometimes the warning comes as a single sound, a sound so sharp, so precise, so impossibly clean, that it cuts through the noise of the cosmos like a blade. That moment arrived on a quiet night, a night when nothing unusual was supposed to happen, a night filled with the normal static of space, pulsars beating, galaxies whispering, stars humming in the background. But then everything changed. A technician at a radio observatory in Australia leaned back in his chair, half listening, half daydreaming, as the receivers traced their endless lines across the screen. And that's when he saw it. A spike. Not a messy one, not a random one, but a smooth, perfect line rising straight up the graph like a heartbeat. One single pulse. Short, sharp, surgical. He frowned, zoomed in, adjusted the filters. The pulse didn't distort. It didn't smear into the usual cosmic fuzz. It stayed perfect. Most cosmic signals wobble, bend, stretch, fall apart, but this one was clean. Too clean. He replayed the data, expecting it to glitch away, but it didn't. There it was again, staring back at him like an eye-opening in the dark. He called in another scientist, then another. Soon, the small room was crowded, every face lit by the same thin white line across the screen. The pulse had hit across multiple frequencies at the exact same moment. A thing nature doesn't do. A thing no comet has ever done. This wasn't noise. This wasn't interference. This was precision. They ran it through every algorithm they had. They compared it to every known natural phenomenon. Pulsars? No. Pulsars repeat. This didn't. Gamma bursts? No. Too clean. No spread. Solar activity? Impossible. Wrong direction. Black hole jets? Not even close. But the strangest part wasn't the pulse itself. It was what happened after. Nothing. Absolute nothing. No second pulse. No echo. No follow-up. Just silence. A silence that felt deliberate, as if something had sent a single knock and then waited. Some scientists argued it was random, a coincidence, a freak cosmic hiccup. But the more they studied it, the more impossible that idea became. The pulse lined up with every anomaly 3I/Atlas had shown so far. The heartbeat-like light curve, the breathing thermal waves, the geometric reflections, the eerie silence bubble in the ecliptic. Everything pointed to intention, to patterns, to control. And now, a pulse. A single, perfect signal from the direction of the object. One of the researchers whispered, "It's like it announced itself." But others weren't convinced, not yet. They tried to break the pattern down mathematically. They mapped its rise time, its fall, its frequency spread. And that's when the room fell quiet, because the pulse didn't just look precise, it looked engineered. Every frequency change lined up in ratios that were almost too neat, too elegant, the kind of ratios that appear in our technology, not in cosmic randomness. One scientist stared at the graph and said, "This is the kind of signature I'd expect from a machine." A machine. The word hung in the air like smoke. Some people stepped back. Others stepped closer. What kind of machine? Built by who? Built for what? No one had answers. But the pulse raised even more disturbing questions. If this was a message, why send just one? Why not repeat it? Why not follow up? Unless it wasn't a message meant to be repeated. Unless it was waiting for something. Waiting for a reply. Waiting for a trigger. Waiting for the world to react. They checked the pulse again. Every detail. Every pixel. It had no drift. Meaning no natural object distorted it. It had no scatter. Meaning no dust cloud interfered. It was clean from start to finish. As if it didn't travel through space, but appeared directly in the antenna. And that idea terrified them, because that would mean the object didn't just emit it. It might have aimed it. But for what purpose? A greeting? A warning? A calibration? A test? The truth was, no one knew. And the silence that followed the pulse felt heavier than the pulse itself. Across the world, observatories stayed awake. Dishes pointed at the sky, computers listening, waiting for the second pulse. Minutes passed, then hours, then days. Nothing. The pulse did not repeat, but it did something worse. It stayed. The signal remained imprinted in the data, clean, sharp, frozen in time like a photograph. The perfect reminder that something out there, something drifting through our solar system, had spoken once and could speak again. Some teams believed the pulse wasn't communication at all. They thought it was a system check, the cosmic equivalent of clearing its throat. Others suggested the pulse might have been intentional, but not aimed at us. Maybe it was meant for something else, something not on Earth, something not human, something that hasn't responded yet. But no matter what theory people chose, one fear remained. The pulse acted like it expected a reply. That was what terrified the lead astronomer the most. He looked at the graph one last time and whispered, "It's waiting, waiting." The universe had gone silent. The instruments were cold. The dishes turned through the night without hearing a second pulse. Yet the feeling wouldn't leave them. Something had reached out. Once. Carefully, cleanly, deliberately. And then it stepped back into the dark, watching, listening, waiting to see what we would do next. Was it a message? Or just the first clue? A signal from something ancient, something intelligent, something alive? No one knows. But the pulse changed everything, because now the patterns around 3I/Atlas weren't just strange, they were speaking, and whatever spoke that first pulse wasn't done. There's a moment in every mystery when the questions stop sounding human and start sounding cosmic. A moment when the universe doesn't just look strange, it thinks strange. For the team studying 3I/Atlas, that moment arrived when they fed its radiation signature into the world's strongest supercomputers, because what came out was not supposed to exist. It started with a simple goal: filter the strange radiation the object had been emitting, clean the noise, find the signal, see what the universe was trying to tell them. But the universe wasn't whispering this time. It was carving messages in the dark. A young data analyst watched the screen as the computer began separating frequencies. Normally, radiation from comets looks messy, like dust scattered across a floor. Spikes, dips, random bursts. But this radiation, it had structure. The analyst leaned forward. The lines weren't random. They weren't chaotic. They curled, they spiraled, they repeated. A shape began to appear. A pattern. The deeper she zoomed in, the more detailed the pattern became. Tiny curves that mirrored larger curves, shapes hiding inside other shapes, like a cosmic fingerprint layered inside itself. She froze, because this wasn't a natural curve. It was a fractal, a mathematical design found in living systems and in engineered systems. But this one was different. It didn't just repeat, it predicted itself. Each curve mapped the next one. Each line anticipated the next shift. It wasn't copying, it was thinking ahead. She called her supervisor. He stared at the screen, silent for a long time, before whispering, "This isn't noise. This is instruction." The room filled quickly. Researchers, physicists, engineers, each one staring at the growing pattern like it was a heartbeat from another world. They fed the data through a second computer. Same result. A third. Same pattern. A fourth. This time using a filter designed to detect human-made signals. And still, the fractal remained. It wasn't an illusion. It wasn't an artifact. It wasn't a trick of light or data. It was real. And it was intelligent. A nervous voice broke the silence. Who or what creates a pattern that predicts itself? No one answered, because the truth was far heavier than any theory they had heard before. Fractals appear in nature, yes, but not like this. Not with this level of precision. Not with this level of recursion. Not with this level of purpose. This was a fractal that evolved as you measured it. A fractal that adapted as the object moved. A fractal that grew more complex the closer 3I/Atlas came to the sun. It was almost like the radiation wasn't just emitting data. It was reacting to being observed. One scientist ran the numbers backward, mapping earlier data to compare. At first, it looked random, but then the fractal structure appeared there too, hidden deeper, weaker, harder to see, meaning the pattern had always been there, just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. That realization sent a chill through the room, because things that reveal themselves on purpose are rarely natural. The team split into groups, some studying the outer layers, others diving deep into the inner loops, and each group found something stranger than the last. The outer loops resembled natural fractals, the kind seen in snowflakes, tree branches, lightning. But the inner loops, they were perfect, mathematically perfect. The kind of perfection you only see in engineered systems, computer code, magnetic structures, digital signals. Lines that weren't simply there. Lines that meant something. One physicist whispered, "It's communicating in a language we don't understand." Another said, "It's like an instruction manual, written for itself." Because that was the strange part. The deeper they looked, the more the pattern seemed designed not for us, but for the object itself. Like it was maintaining something, calibrating something, balancing something deep inside. A living system? A machine system? No one could tell. But whatever it wasn't static. The fractals shifted over time, not randomly, but intentionally. Sometimes expanding outward, sometimes curling inward, sometimes holding still as if waiting. Waiting for what? More sunlight? More proximity? More attention? No one knew. But one thing became impossible to deny. The more they observed the object, the more the fractal grew in complexity. It reacted to observation. It answered attention. It evolved when studied. One researcher compared it to a neural network, an artificial intelligence system adapting in real time. Another compared it to DNA, layers of information packed inside even deeper layers. But someone else had a darker thought. What if this isn't a pattern? What if this is behavior? Behavior, a word that sat heavy on the table. Because rocks don't behave, comets don't evolve. Radiation doesn't respond. But this did. A supercomputer tried to predict the next layer of the fractal using all the known rules of chaos theory. It failed. Then it tried again with machine learning. It failed again. Whatever was generating this pattern wasn't random, and it wasn't following rules we knew. It was following rules it created for itself. At one point, the fractal collapsed inward, as if the object had shut itself down. The lines shrank, the loops faded. The structure tightened. Everyone held their breath. Seconds passed, then minutes. And suddenly, the fractal exploded outward in a burst of complexity. Thousands of new lines. New curves, new layers, like it had woken up. One scientist whispered, "It knows we're watching." Another said, "No, it wants us watching." But the most frightening realization came from the mathematician in the room, the one who finally counted the loops. There were 7 repeating tiers in the pattern, 7 layers of geometry folding into each other, 7 levels of information, 7 cycles of evolution. 7, the same number of thermal waves, the same number of reflectivity spikes, the same number of intervals in the silence bubble. Everything aligned, not by chance, not by luck. but by intention. 3I/Atlas wasn't just showing patterns, it was building them, living inside them, responding through them. This wasn't random radiation. This wasn't cosmic noise. This wasn't a comet. This was a system older than our civilization, more complex than our mathematics, and more deliberate than any natural object in the known universe. The final question didn't feel scientific anymore. It felt personal. It felt human. Who or what creates a pattern that predicts itself? The answer, whatever it was, waited inside 3I/Atlas. And the deeper the scientist looked, the more it felt like the object itself was looking right back. There are moments in science when the universe feels like it's holding its breath, as if something old and hidden is about to open its eyes. For the teams watching 3I/Atlas, that moment came in the hours before dawn, when the object began to change. Not slowly, not naturally, but in a way that felt intentional. It began with a temperature drop. Sensors on a distant probe picked it up first. A sharp, sudden shift that made the numbers fall like a stone dropped into deep water. Just hours earlier, the object had been warm, pulsing with heat, breathing in cycles no comet had ever shown. But now, the heat collapsed. The radiation signature flattened. The waves cooled. The pulse slowed. Not faded, slowed. Like a heartbeat preparing itself. Like something settling into position. The first scientist to notice the shift thought it was an error. He rubbed his eyes, checked the feed, ran the calibration again. Same result. 3I/Atlas was turning cold. Too cold. The kind of cold that doesn't happen by accident. The kind of cold that feels like a system shutting down or powering up. He called his supervisor. Then another. Soon the room was filled with quiet panic. Every face lit by the same eerie data. Someone whispered, "It's like it's bracing for something." But the strangest part wasn't the cold. It was what happened next. The pulses, the same pulses that had behaved like heartbeats, began to stretch. Slower, calmer, more deliberate. 38-minute intervals turned into 40, then 42, then 45. Not irregular, not chaotic, just slower. Like the object was conserving energy, like it was preparing. Across the world, every observatory tracking 3I/Atlas saw the same change. The graphs didn't jitter with noise, they shifted with grace. Almost with purpose. Scientists checked the sun's position, checked the angle, checked everything that might explain the change. Only one thing stood out. The object was approaching sunrise on the spacecraft's sensors, the moment when the sun's light would hit it directly, the moment when whatever was inside might be exposed. A low voice broke the silence. It's doing this on purpose. But the change wasn't finished, because then the object's rotation began to stabilize. Not gradually, not due to physics, not the way comets spin when heated unevenly. This stabilization was clean. Too clean. The rotational wobble, something every natural object has, just disappeared. One moment, 3I/Atlas was turning with a slight tilt, like a lopsided wheel. The next moment, it snapped into perfect alignment, perfect balance, perfect symmetry, as if an invisible force corrected it, as if something inside shifted its center of mass. as if it chose to balance itself. A scientist stared at the screen, breath held tight, and whispered, "No rock does that. Because space rocks don't adjust their rotation. Machines do. Vehicles do. Living things do. But dead ice, dust, fragments of old stars, they do not correct themselves. Not like this." Across the world, more teams confirmed the same impossible truth. 3I/Atlas had stabilized its rotation at the exact moment the pulses slowed and the radiation cooled and the object prepared to enter sunlight. It felt less like physics and more like intention. One researcher said, "It looks like it's entering a mode." Another said, "It's preparing for exposure." And someone else, someone older, someone who'd seen too many strange things in their career, said the thing no one wanted to voice, "It's waiting for someone." The room fell still. Because that idea wasn't just strange. It was terrifying. Why would an object, something that had crossed interstellar space, prepare itself like this? Why would it cool down before sunrise? Why would it slow its pulses? Why would it fix its rotation? Unless it knew sunrise mattered, unless it was changing states, preparing for a new phase, a new function, a new awakening. The data grew stranger. Thermal maps showed faint heat moving inside the object, not spreading randomly, but shifting with direction, like currents, like pathways, like veins. The idea was too wild to say aloud, but it sat in every mind. Something inside the object was moving, not breathing, not pulsing, but reorganizing, changing position, changing shape, changing purpose. Even the radiation signature reflected the shift. What had once been a complex, fractal pattern began to fold inward, simplifying, tightening, compressing itself into a more compact structure, like information being stored, like memory being saved, like a system shutting down non-essential functions. One scientist murmured, "It's transitioning." Another whispered, "To what?" But no one had an answer. Not yet. The countdown to sunrise approached. The sun's light inched towards the object's surface, and with every passing minute, 3I/Atlas grew quieter. Not dead, not dormant, just still, focused, waiting. The tension in the observation rooms grew heavy. People spoke in low voices. Monitors beeped softly in the dark. Everyone knew something was coming, something big, something unlike anything humanity had seen before. And then, just moments before the first flicker of sunlight touched the object, the pulses stopped. Completely. Not slowed, not weakened. Stopped. A perfect flat line across every frequency. The object fell silent in a way that felt impossible, unnatural, deliberate. The silence wasn't like before, not the accidental silence of the ecliptic. This silence felt intentional, like a held breath, like suspense, like the pause before a reveal. One scientist exhaled shakily and said, "This is the last quiet moment." No one dared argue, because everything, the cooling, the stabilizing, the slowing pulses, the shrinking fractal, the shifting heat, all pointed to the same terrifying truth. 3I/Atlas was preparing for sunlight, for exposure, for activation, or for something far more unsettling, for someone. And as the sun finally slowly crept over the curve of the object's surface, painting the first touch of gold across whatever lay beneath, the world held its breath with it, because whatever happened next would change everything. Some moments arrive so quietly, so gently, that no one realizes the world is about to change. And then there are moments like this. One, moments that break the sky open. The first sunlight was supposed to be ordinary. A simple event, a predictable moment in the object's orbit. Just a beam of light touching a piece of frozen rock drifting through space. But 3I/Atlas was not frozen rock. The teams had prepared for everything, a flare, a reflection, a burst of heat. But nothing prepared them for what actually happened. The instant sunlight reached the object, the monitors didn't brighten. They exploded. A blinding surge, whiter than a star, sharper than lightning, filled every screen across every observatory watching it. Sensors overloaded, cameras burned out. Data feeds crashed in a burst of static. For 5 whole seconds, the world lost sight of 3I/Atlas. 5 seconds of white, 5 seconds of blindness, 5 seconds that felt like a lifetime. And then the sensors came back, slowly, cautiously, like eyes opening after staring at the sun. And what they saw sent a shock through every room. The surface of the object was changing, not melting, not cracking, reshaping. Like something beneath the surface was pushing forward, breaking through an outer shell that suddenly seemed too soft, too thin, too temporary. What had once looked like a dull, dark, rocky crust now shimmered with contours, lines, ridges, panels shifting into new positions, like a machine unfolding, like a creature stretching after a long sleep, like something ancient remembering itself. One scientist whispered the word everyone else was afraid to say. Awakening, because there was no other explanation. No natural object rearranges its surface because sunlight touches it. Heat can crack ice. Light can burn dust. But this wasn't cracking. This was articulation, movement, purpose. The shape changed again. Sections of the surface, smooth, metallic-looking plates, tilted towards the sun as if absorbing the light with intention. Angles aligned, edges locked into place. New patterns appeared, glowing faintly under the thin golden layer of dawn. Even the shadows around the object changed shape, growing sharper, more geometric, more unnatural, as if the entire structure had shifted into a new form. The team scrambled to process every pixel of data, every frame, every heat signature. The thermal map lit up in patterns that made no sense. Heat moving along lines too straight, too symmetrical, like power flowing through channels. The radiation signature, one already known for its strange fractal structure, didn't return to normal. It evolved. The fractal expanded outward, growing more complex, more vibrant, as if the object were broadcasting something new, something alive. And then came the most shocking detail. The pulses returned, but they weren't like the old ones, not the soft, heart-like rhythms from before. These new pulses were faster, sharper, more focused, like signals, like activation. Every instrument that received them showed the same impossible precision. Mathematical, clean, deliberate. A message, an announcement. No one knew. No one could even guess. But one thing became certain. Whatever this object was, it had been waiting for the sun. The sunlight didn't wake it by accident. It triggered it, flipped a switch, activated a system, awakened something that had been asleep for centuries, maybe longer. Scientists compared the before and after images side by side. The transformation was undeniable. Before sunlight, the object looked dead, cold, rocky, silent. After sunlight, it looked formed, engineered. Panels where none existed. Ridges that had not been there hours earlier. Curves replaced by angles. Angles replaced by symmetry. It didn't resemble a comet anymore. It resembled a device. No one in the room dared speak the obvious word, but the silence said it anyway. Machine. And if it was a machine, then sunlight wasn't just warming it. Sunlight was powering it, charging it, feeding it, activating circuits long dormant in the dark. One researcher spoke in a shaky whisper. It didn't wake up because of sunlight. It responded to sunlight. Another added, it was waiting for dawn. But the most unsettling question lingered heavy in the air. Why? Why would a structure, one that had crossed interstellar space, wait for light from our sun? What was so special about this star? This moment? This exact point in its journey? And, more importantly, what was it preparing for? Because the changes weren't random. They weren't chaotic. They were deliberate. Particles around the object shifted in patterns. Tiny dust trails spiraled around its new edges. Electromagnetic fields pulsed outward in faint, beautiful waves. It was positioning itself. For what? A message? A maneuver? A transformation? No one knew. But the data grew stranger with every passing second. Light sensors picked up something impossible. A faint glow coming from within the object. Not reflected light. Not external heat. Internal light. A soft, pulsing illumination moving beneath the surface like a heartbeat. Like something alive. The glow grew brighter, more focused, more directed. A scientist stared at the live feed and whispered, "This isn't a reaction. This is intention." And then, as if confirming her fear, the object froze. Perfectly still, rotation locked, panels aligned, everything quieted into a single, unnatural stillness. A stillness that felt less like sleep and more like readiness. The sun continued to rise over it, drawing long golden lines across its newly formed geometry. And as the light reached its peak, the glow inside 3I/Atlas pulsed once. A slow, deep, steady signal. Not frantic, not chaotic. Calm, controlled, alive. The pulse felt like the end of something, and the beginning of something else. A transition, a birth, an arrival. One scientist, voice barely audible, said, "This isn't awakening us. It's awakening itself." And as the data kept streaming in, showing structures that shouldn't exist, energy that shouldn't form, and patterns too intentional to ignore, the world realized a simple, terrifying truth. Whatever woke up inside 3I/Atlas did not wake up by accident. It woke up because something was about to begin. Some discoveries don't shout, they whisper. They hide in the quiet corners of darkness, waiting for the right pair of eyes, the right moment, the right question to finally reveal themselves. And for 3I/Atlas, that truth lived on the side no sunlight could touch, the dark side. It happened hours after sunrise lit the object's surface, after the blinding flash, after the reshaping, after the awakening. A spacecraft trailing in the comet's shadow finally captured images of the unlit hemisphere, a region untouched by the sun, preserved in a cold stillness. The team expected rough terrain, craters, chaos, the sharp, jagged personality of a natural object carved by time. But the first image did not look natural, not even close. The photo showed shapes, lines, edges that were almost too clean. Nobody spoke at first. It was the kind of silence that felt like someone pressing a hand, gently, firmly, over your mouth. The scientist processing the image blinked twice. He zoomed in, then zoomed in again. There, in the darkness, were straight lines, perfectly straight, stretching across the surface like ribs of a structure, repeating angles, right angles, the kind of geometry you find in buildings, ships, technology, not in comets, not in nature, never in nature. He called in his supervisor without saying a word. The man walked in, stopped behind him, and froze. Everyone knew what they were looking at, but no one wanted to be the first to speak it aloud, because speaking something makes it real. And this was too real. More images poured in, higher resolution, different angles. What they saw next made their stomachs sink. There were grooves, long corridors etched into the crust, symmetrical shapes connected by repeating patterns, surfaces that looked carved or molded or assembled, structures, the kind that don't appear by accident, the kind that only appear when something builds them. The room filled with whispers, nervous, fragile. Careful, someone finally said the quiet word, machine. And once it was spoken, the fear grew legs. If the object was a machine, then it wasn't a dead traveler. It wasn't a cosmic ice ball. It was a vessel, a device, a construction, something with purpose, something with design. And yet, the data revealed something even stranger, because beneath those lines and angles, beneath the cold, shadowed crust, heat was moving, not spreading, not radiating randomly like a warm rock, moving, flowing in channels that snaked beneath the surface, internal heat signatures drifting from one section to another, like currents inside a living organism or energy routing through circuitry. The scientists watched the thermal patterns in disbelief. One moment, the heat was concentrated near the equator. The next moment, it shifted, smooth, coordinated, toward the lower hemisphere, then inward, as if being funneled into a central chamber. Not a reaction, a process, a choice, a function being performed. One researcher whispered, "It's doing something." Another replied, "It's always been doing something." But now they could see it. The thermal activity grew more complex the deeper they scanned. Rows of faint heat spots formed repeating sequences, like nodes, like components. The patterns weren't chaotic. They were organized, matched, mirrored, indexed, like pieces of a machine waking up along a grid. A senior scientist leaned back in his chair, hands trembling slightly. "This isn't just a machine," he said quietly. "This is architecture." And in that moment, the object no longer felt distant. It felt inhabited. The fear spread fast. Because architecture means purpose. Purpose means design. Design means builders. And builders means one thing. Someone made it. But who? When? Why? And where were they now? The questions came like a tide. Was this machine abandoned? Was it traveling on autopilot? Was it damaged? Sleeping? Searching? Returning? Or worse, was it waiting? No one had answers, only possibilities dark enough to keep them awake at night. They replayed the heat maps again and again, watched the internal patterns drift in coordinated waves, watched new signatures appear where none existed hours earlier. Something inside was activating. Something deep within the object had responded to sunlight. Then continued working in the cold dark. It wasn't random. It wasn't instinct. It wasn't geological. It was behavior. The live feed zoomed closer. A panel, massive, curved, shifted slightly in the darkness. A spasm of motion so subtle it almost went unnoticed. But it happened. Movement, torque, compression, release. Like a hinge flexing, a joint rotating, a mechanism adjusting itself in the shadow. The scientists stared in shock. Some leaned forward. Some stepped back. One whispered, "It's alive." Another corrected, "No, it's operational." And that distinction made the room feel colder. Because alive implies nature, instinct, emotion. Operational implies design, control, purpose. Something made this thing. Something built it with intention, and that intention was only now revealing itself. They replayed the dark side footage frame by frame, searching for meaning in the geometry. Some saw structure. Some saw language. Some saw a map or a pattern or a blueprint. One scientist finally said, "This looks like engineering." Another added, "Advanced engineering." But the oldest researcher in the room, the one who had studied every unusual object humanity had ever found, shook his head. "Not advanced," he said softly. "Ancient. Ancient." The word felt heavy, terrifying. Because an ancient machine still functioning, still reacting, still awakening, means its creators were far beyond us, older, smarter, gone, or not gone at all. That last possibility froze the room. Because if this was built, then someone, somewhere, knows how to build things like this. And if it's still active, still responding, still changing, then maybe its creators aren't extinct. Maybe they're out there. Maybe they're watching. Maybe this object isn't just a machine. Maybe it's a messenger, a probe, a warning, a relic, a seed, or something far more unimaginable. The chapter ends with one final image, a close-up infrared scan of the object's core, deep inside the structure. A single point of heat burns brighter than everything else. A heart, a reactor, a mind. Whatever it is, it glows like something alive. And the final question hangs heavy, unanswered, haunting. If this is a machine, then where is its creator now? Some endings don't feel like endings. They feel like doorways, quiet, half open, waiting for someone brave enough to step through. And for the team studying 3I/Atlas, this final moment didn't feel like a conclusion. It felt like a beginning, because every piece of data pointed in the same impossible direction. This object was not natural, not accidental, not born of stars or dust. It was designed, engineered, built with a level of intelligence older than anything in our history, maybe older than our species itself. But the truth didn't arrive all at once. It came piece by piece, like a puzzle assembling itself in front of them. The geometric surfaces, the thermal patterns, the pulses, the fractal signatures, the awakening in sunlight, every clue whispered the same haunting message. This is not a comet. It is something made, something sent, something purposeful. Still, no one knew by who or why. Or how long ago? Until the probe sent its last transmission. And everything changed. The probe had ventured closer to 3I/Atlas than any human-made object before. It circled the machine, scanning every inch, collecting data that could rewrite our understanding of the universe. But as the probe approached what analysts believed was the core, its systems began to fail. First, the cameras flickered. Then the thermal sensors spiked. Then the radio feed went silent. For a moment, everyone feared the probe was lost forever. But then, minutes later, a small, final packet of data blinked onto the screens. Corrupted, fragmented, barely readable. A mess of broken symbols, fractured waveforms, garbled spectral lines. It looked like static holding a secret. The team worked for hours, then days, trying to reconstruct the file, trying to clean it, trying to pull meaning from the noise. But the corruption was too deep, almost like something, or someone, had scrambled it on purpose. Almost like a firewall, a lock, a boundary not meant to be crossed. But buried inside the corrupted file, there was one piece that wasn't damaged. One sequence that repeated over and over. A coordinate, not a phrase. Not a warning, not a message. A location, but not anywhere in our solar system. Not in our galactic neighborhood. Not even in the Milky Way. It pointed far beyond, to a small, faint region just outside our galaxy's edge. A place with no stars bright enough to see with the naked eye. No known planets, no recorded civilizations. Nothing. A dark patch of sky that had never mattered until now. Over and over, the coordinate repeated, as if the probe's final act was to deliver this single clue. A scientist stared at the sequence for a long time before speaking. "It isn't pointing to us." Another whispered, "It's pointing home. Home." The word swept through the room like a cold wind. Because if the machine had a home, if it had an origin, if it belonged somewhere, then this object was not wandering. It was traveling. Traveling here. Traveling now. The team debated for hours. Some believed the coordinate was a destination, a place the object intended to return to. Others believed it was a memory, a marker, left behind by its creators. But one theory rose above the rest. Quiet and terrifying. It's a beacon, not calling for help, not calling for rescue. Calling for connection, calling to say, "I have arrived." But the darker interpretation hung over them like a shadow. Or, "I have found them." Was the machine calling back to something? Was it reporting? Was it signaling that it reached its target? Was Earth its destination? The probe's corrupted file offered no answers. Only that single repeating coordinate, blinking like a heartbeat in the dark. Some scientists feared the message was a warning, one last attempt to tell us that whatever built this machine was not something we wanted to meet. Others believed it was an invitation, that the machine was waiting, watching, hoping to reconnect with its makers across the cold gap between galaxies. But the final debate came from the oldest researcher in the room, the one who had witnessed patterns in everything from asteroids to cosmic radiation to deep space anomalies. He looked at the coordinate for a long time and finally said, "This thing didn't come here by accident. It came with a purpose. It came with instructions. And now it's reporting back." A heavy silence filled the room. Not fear, not confusion, reverence. Because the truth, the real truth, was bigger than anything they had imagined. We were not alone. We had never been alone. And now, For the first time in human history, something out there knew exactly where we were. Everyone stared at the coordinate one last time. A tiny cluster of numbers. A single point in an ocean of black. Silent, cold, calling, or warning. No one could tell. But one thing was certain. 3I/Atlas was not the mystery. It was the message. And the final question lingered in every mind, quiet, trembling, heavy with the weight of everything they had seen. Is it calling us or warning us? Because whichever answer is true will change the fate of humanity forever.